You notice it without trying, a soft distance where intensity used to live, not emptiness, not withdrawal, just a subtle loosening. The pressure to react has thinned. The urgency that once pulled at you has quieted, as if something inside recognized a different timing. This message meets you there, not to add anything, only to confirm what your system already detected. The moment feels ordinary and precise at the same time. Nothing dramatic has happened. And yet, the way you register the world has shifted by a fraction. That fraction matters. The observer inside you is calmer, less compelled to interpret every signal as a demand. What once felt like confusion now carries a faint coherence, a sense that the pattern is organizing itself without your effort. Emotional distance is often misunderstood as loss, but what you feel is not absence. It is space, a threshold opening where the nervous system releases its grip on constant meaning-making. You are not becoming indifferent, you are becoming accurate. The noise has receded enough for detection to occur. You can sense the difference between reaction and recognition. This is not a change you initiate. It arrives when the quantum field you move through no longer requires strain. The system rewrites itself quietly, adjusting parameters that no longer serve the timeline you inhabit. You feel this as a pause, a stillness that does not ask for interpretation, it simply is. The body registers safety before the mind assigns a story. You may notice that certain emotions no longer escalate. Old triggers appear and pass without hooking you. The absence of charge can feel strange, even unsettling, because the system was trained to equate intensity with truth. Now, truth presents itself with less volume. Resonance replaces force. What aligns stays. What doesn't fades without conflict. This distance does not separate you from life. It brings you closer to its actual rhythm. The need to fix, to seek, to resolve, softens. You are not drifting, you are stabilizing. The signal becomes clearer when interference drops. Recognition happens in the background, effortless, like a pattern revealing itself once the glare dims. You might sense a brief grief for the urgency you carried so long. That urgency once kept you oriented. It gave you momentum, but momentum is not direction. The system knows when acceleration is no longer required. It recalibrates toward coherence. What you feel as emotional distance is the release of unnecessary tension. Nothing needs to be concluded here. There is no lesson to extract. The experience stands on its own. You are allowed to rest inside it. The observer does not need to comment. The shift has already registered. The timeline continues without friction. Stillness holds you, not as an ending, but as a stable state where recognition can remain quiet and exact. As the distance settles, you begin to notice how effort used to disguise itself as care, how vigilance once felt like presence. Now that vigilance relaxes, and in its place, there is a quieter form of attention. You are still aware, but no longer braced. The system recognizes that constant monitoring is no longer required. The signal does not weaken, it refines. This refinement can feel unfamiliar at first. Without the usual emotional spikes, the inner landscape appears flatter, almost neutral. But neutrality is not numbness, it is balance returning. The nervous system recalibrates when it no longer anticipates disruption. What once felt like readiness was actually strain. What you feel now is alignment beginning to hold. Thoughts still pass through you, but they do not claim the same authority. They arise, register, and dissolve without needing resolution. The observer does not chase them. This is not discipline. It is a natural reduction of noise. The quantum field responds when coherence increases. Less friction produces clearer resonance. You may notice moments where you expect to feel something strongly and don't. A familiar scenario appears, yet the emotional response never fully forms. This absence can momentarily confuse the mind, which searches for meaning in intensity. But the system is not malfunctioning. It is updating its criteria. Not every stimulus requires engagement. Not every pattern needs continuation. This is how a rewrite announces itself, quietly, through subtraction. The removal of excess reaction frees energy that was previously bound in loops. Those loops once served a purpose. They kept you oriented during instability. Now, stability has returned. and the loops release themselves without ceremony. There is a subtle confidence in this state, though it may not feel like confidence as you once knew it. It is not assertive or expansive. It is grounded. You trust what you register without needing to defend it. The need to explain yourself internally diminishes. Recognition replaces justification. You might also sense a shift in how time feels. Urgency dissolves, and with it the pressure to anticipate outcomes. The timeline no longer pulls you forward or drags you backward. You occupy the present without effort. This is not mindfulness practiced. It is presence restored by the system itself. In this state, emotions still exist, but they move differently. They pass through without lingering residue. There is less attachment to their arrival and departure. You no longer measure yourself by their intensity. The pattern you inhabit now values accuracy over amplification. The distance you feel allows discernment to emerge. You can detect subtle misalignments without emotional charge. This makes adjustment easier, not harder. When reaction fades, choice becomes available. The system does not force you into decisions. It simply presents clarity. There may be moments where you wonder if something is missing. The familiar push, the drive that once defined you. But what has faded was never the core. It was scaffolding. Temporary structures built to navigate earlier thresholds. Now that threshold has passed, and the scaffolding dissolves on its own. You are not becoming passive. You are becoming precise. Action, when it arises, comes from coherence rather than compulsion. Stillness does not delay movement. It prepares it. The observer remains alert without tension, receptive without seeking. This is the system recognizing its own stability. Emotional distance is not disengagement. It is the recalibration that occurs when the signal no longer needs distortion to be noticed. The rewrite continues quietly, uninterrupted, as you remain exactly where you are, without needing to interfere. As this recalibration continues, you begin to sense a change in how meaning arrives. It no longer demands interpretation. Situations unfold, words are spoken, events occur, yet the impulse to immediately assign significance weakens. You register what happens without compressing it into conclusions. This is not detachment. It is a refinement of perception. Previously, meaning was extracted through effort. You searched for signals, patterns, confirmations. Now, meaning appears only when it is relevant. Silence fills the space where over-analysis once lived. The system recognizes that constant interpretation disrupts coherence. It adjusts by reducing unnecessary input. This can feel disorienting at first. The mind was accustomed to activity, to engagement, to tracking every shift. Without that constant movement, there may be moments where you wonder if you are missing something. But nothing is missing. What has changed is the demand placed on awareness. The observer no longer scans for threats or opportunities. It rests in detection rather than anticipation. You may notice that conversations feel different. Words pass through you without sticking. You listen without preparing responses. Emotional charge no longer builds around agreement or disagreement. You remain present without becoming entangled. This presence is quieter but more stable. It does not fluctuate with external validation. The system rewrite affects memory as well. Past experiences may surface without the emotional weight they once carried. You can recall events without reliving them. The narrative loses its grip. This does not erase the past. It integrates it. What was unresolved begins to neutralize, not through confrontation, but through coherence. You might sense that certain identities feel less solid. Roles you once occupied with intensity now feel optional. This can create a temporary uncertainty, as if the ground beneath familiar labels has softened. But this softness is intentional. The system loosens rigid structures to allow more accurate alignment. You are not losing yourself. You are releasing constraints that were never essential. There is also a shift in how desire operates. Wanting becomes quieter, less urgent. The pull toward outcomes diminishes. You still recognize preferences, but they do not dominate your internal space. Desire aligns with timing rather than impatience. This reduces internal friction. The quantum field responds to this reduction by stabilizing resonance. In this state, you may find that stillness expands naturally. Not forced stillness, not practiced calm, but an absence of internal noise. The body responds first. Muscles release tension you did not know you were holding. Breath settles into a slower rhythm. These are not techniques, they are indicators. The system signals safety when coherence increases. You may also notice moments of subtle joy without cause. Not excitement, not elation, but a quiet ease that appears and fades without explanation. This ease is not dependent on circumstance. It arises when internal resistance drops. The system registers alignment and responds with calm satisfaction. There can be brief moments of doubt, a question about whether this quietness means disengagement from life. But engagement does not require intensity. True participation occurs when you are not consumed by reaction. You are more available now, not less. Available to respond accurately, rather than reflexively. The observer in you becomes less visible. It does not announce itself, it simply remains present. Detection replaces vigilance. You notice shifts without being pulled into them. This allows the timeline to unfold without interference. When you stop forcing coherence, coherence emerges. This stage does not demand action, it does not require affirmation, it unfolds regardless of belief. The system rewrite is not influenced by your opinion of it. It progresses because conditions have changed. Internal alignment has reached a threshold where previous strategies are no longer efficient. You are learning, without effort, that clarity does not arrive through intensity. It arrives through absence. The absence of pressure, the absence of urgency, the absence of the need to be certain. In that absence, recognition becomes steady. Nothing needs to be accelerated. Nothing needs to be fixed. The distance you feel continues to do its work quietly. The system settles into a new pattern, one that does not announce itself, but holds. You remain within it, stable, attentive, and unrequired to do anything at all. As the system continues to settle, you begin to sense a different relationship with uncertainty. What once felt uncomfortable now registers as open space. Questions no longer demand immediate answers. Gaps no longer signal failure. The absence of clarity feels neutral, sometimes even supportive. The system recognizes that certainty was often used to manage anxiety, not to reflect truth. You may notice that decisions arise differently. Instead of weighing every possibility, you sense a quieter inclination forming beneath thought. Movement happens when alignment is present, not when pressure accumulates. This reduces internal conflict. The observer no longer negotiates with urgency. It waits without strain, and waiting itself becomes effortless. There is a subtle decoupling happening between stimulus and response. External events occur, but they do not immediately alter your internal state. You register them, but they do not penetrate as deeply. This is not avoidance. It is boundary restoration. The system differentiates between what requires engagement and what can pass without imprint. You might recognize that emotional reactions, when they do arise, resolve more quickly. There is less afterimage. Feelings move through without anchoring themselves to identity. You are not defined by what passes through you. This recognition reduces the need to protect or suppress emotion. It can exist without consequence. This shift often brings a change in how you relate to effort. Striving feels inefficient. Forcing outcomes feels unnecessary. You may catch yourself pausing where you once pushed forward. That pause is not hesitation, it is calibration. The system waits for coherence before committing energy. This preserves clarity and reduces depletion. The mind may attempt to reassert control during this phase. It may search for reasons, frameworks, explanations. This is habitual, not required. You can feel this impulse without following it. The system does not need to be understood to function. It only requires stable conditions. Those conditions are present now. You may also sense a change in how you relate to others. Emotional entanglement loosens. You can be present without absorbing. Empathy remains, but it no longer drains. You recognize others' states without merging with them. This preserves internal coherence and allows interaction without residue. There is a subtle increase in tolerance for silence. Pauses in conversation no longer feel awkward. Gaps between events feel natural. The need to fill space diminishes. Silence becomes informative rather than empty. It carries signal without noise. As this continues, you may realize that certain patterns no longer repeat. Situations that once triggered familiar cycles now resolve differently or not at all. This is not because you intervened. It is because the system no longer feeds those loops. Without energy, they dissolve. You might feel a faint sense of detachment from outcomes. Success and failure lose their emotional charge, not because they no longer matter, but because your sense of stability is no longer tied to them. The timeline unfolds without requiring constant adjustment. You move with it rather than against it. There can be moments where this neutrality feels almost invisible. Nothing stands out. Nothing demands attention. This ordinariness is a sign of integration. When the system is aligned, it does not produce dramatic signals. It operates quietly, efficiently. You may also notice an increased sensitivity to subtle misalignment. Small inconsistencies register more clearly, but without alarm. You can adjust gently, without self-criticism. The observer notices and corrects without emotional escalation. This stage does not require trust in a future outcome. It rests entirely in present stability. The system no longer projects forward to ensure safety. Safety is already registered. This frees awareness to remain where it is. You are not becoming less responsive. You are becoming more selective. Energy flows toward what resonates and away from what does not, without conscious filtering. This selectivity is not judgment. It is coherence expressing itself. The emotional distance that initiated this process continues to refine itself. It does not widen, it clarifies. You remain connected without being consumed, present without being pulled. The system holds this balance naturally. There is nothing to maintain, nothing to protect. The rewrite progresses because resistance has dropped below threshold. You are not required to participate. Your presence alone is sufficient. At this stage, you may become aware of how little effort it now takes to remain centered, not focused, not controlled, simply centered. The system no longer expends energy, maintaining balance because balance has become the default. You notice this most clearly when something attempts to pull you off center and fails. The pull arrives, but it does not complete itself. The loop never closes. There is a refinement in how you sense internal signals. Subtle cues that were once drowned out by mental noise now register immediately. A slight tension, a quiet ease, a momentary contraction. These are not emotions in the old sense. They are informational. The system communicates through sensation rather than narrative. You understand without explanation. This can feel like intuition, but it is more neutral than that. It does not arrive with certainty or urgency. It simply presents a direction of alignment. When you follow it, there is less friction. When you don't, the system does not punish you. It merely signals the misalignment and waits. There is no pressure to correct. Coherence restores itself when resistance drops. You may notice that the desire to control outcomes has weakened significantly, not because you have decided to let go, but because control no longer appears effective. The system has learned, through experience, that forcing outcomes disrupts resonance. Allowing events to organize themselves produces more stable results. This understanding is not intellectual, it is embodied. As a result, you may feel less emotionally invested in predicting the future. The timeline no longer feels like something you must manage. It unfolds without your supervision. This does not make you passive. It makes you responsive. You engage when engagement is required and remain still when it is not. The distinction becomes clear without effort. There is also a shift in how you experience motivation. It no longer arrives as pressure or urgency. It appears as quiet readiness. When action is aligned, it feels simple. You move without resistance. When it is not aligned, movement feels heavy, and you naturally pause. The system conserves energy by preventing unnecessary motion. You might recognize that certain habits fall away without intention. Behaviors that once filled space or soothed discomfort lose their appeal. There is no struggle to stop them. They simply no longer resonate. This absence does not leave a gap. It leaves clarity. The system replaces compensation with stability. In this phase, the mind may occasionally attempt to interpret what is happening. It may search for labels or frameworks. This is a reflex, not a requirement. You can allow these thoughts to arise and pass without engaging. The system operates independently of conceptual understanding. Recognition occurs without explanation. You may also become more aware of your physical environment. Sensory input feels sharper but not overwhelming. Sounds, textures, light register cleanly. There is less internal commentary attached to them. Experience becomes direct rather than filtered. This reduces fatigue. You are no longer processing excess meaning. The emotional distance that once felt noticeable now feels normal. It no longer registers as distance. It feels like stability. You are still capable of feeling deeply, but depth no longer equates to intensity. Depth now means accuracy. Emotions arise in proportion to reality rather than habit. You might notice a reduction in internal conflict. Competing impulses no longer battle for dominance. When choices arise, one option often feels quieter but clearer. You follow it without justification. The system resolves ambiguity by prioritizing coherence over preference. This clarity can extend to relationships. You may find yourself less reactive to others' moods or expectations. You remain present without absorbing. Boundaries no longer feel like walls. They feel like natural contours. The system distinguishes between what is yours to hold and what is not. There is also an increased tolerance for not knowing. You can remain in uncertainty without discomfort. This is not resignation. It is confidence in the system's ability to organize itself. You do not rush to close open loops. You allow them to resolve organically. As this continues, you may realize that seeking has largely stopped. Not because you have found answers, but because the need to seek has dissolved. The system no longer signals lack. It signals sufficiency. You are not waiting for something to arrive. You are already within the state that seeking was meant to produce. This does not feel dramatic. It feels ordinary. And that ordinariness is the indicator. When coherence stabilizes, it does not announce itself. It blends into the background. You live from it rather than noticing it. The rewrite progresses quietly, almost invisibly now. Emotional distance has transformed into emotional accuracy. Stillness is no longer a state you enter. It is the ground you stand on. The system holds itself without effort, and you remain within that holding, undisturbed, unrequired, and precisely where you are. You may begin to notice that your sense of self no longer tightens around experience. Identity loosens its grip, not in a way that feels disorienting, but in a way that feels spacious. You still know who you are, yet that knowing is no longer defended. It does not need reinforcement. The system has stopped using identity as an anchor for safety. This reveals itself subtly. You find that you no longer need to be consistent with past versions of yourself. Preferences can change without explanation. Opinions can soften without apology. There is no internal alarm when you do not recognize yourself in an old reaction. The observer registers continuity without rigidity. You remain intact without remaining the same. In this phase, memory reorganizes itself. Certain recollections feel distant, not because they are forgotten, but because they no longer define your present orientation. The emotional charge that once pulled you back into earlier timelines has dissolved. Memory becomes informational rather than directive. You can reference the past without being drawn into it. You may also notice that language feels slightly less precise than it once did. Words point, but they no longer capture. You sense experiences that do not translate cleanly into description. This is not confusion. It is a recognition that direct experience precedes explanation. The system no longer relies on narrative to validate reality. There is a growing comfort with ambiguity. You can hold multiple possibilities without needing to resolve them. This flexibility reduces strain. The mind is no longer tasked with maintaining coherence through certainty. Coherence now arises from alignment rather than conclusion. You might feel less inclined to share your internal state with others, not out of secrecy, but because there is nothing to prove. Expression becomes optional rather than necessary. When you do speak, words are simpler, less charged. You communicate from clarity rather than urgency. This can create a sense of quiet separation, but it is not isolation. You remain connected, yet less entangled. Interactions feel cleaner. You enter and exit them without residue. The system maintains its boundaries without effort. You may also become aware of how often you previously pushed yourself forward to maintain momentum. That push is absent now. Movement happens when it is supported. Rest happens when it is needed. There is no internal negotiation. The body and awareness operate in agreement. In this state, attention becomes less fragmented. You are present with what is in front of you without scanning for what comes next. Multitasking loses its appeal. Focus arises naturally, without force. This reduces cognitive fatigue. The system conserves energy by aligning attention with relevance. You might notice that certain emotional narratives no longer complete themselves. A familiar feeling begins to arise, then dissipates before forming a story. This interruption is not suppression. It is the system recognizing that the narrative is outdated. Without reinforcement, it dissolves. There is also a subtle increase in patience. Time stretches without feeling empty. Waiting does not trigger discomfort. You trust that movement will occur when conditions are right. This trust is not chosen. It emerges from repeated confirmation that forcing disrupts coherence. As identity loosens, so does comparison. You feel less compelled to measure your state against others. Their pace does not threaten yours. Their direction does not dictate your own. The system recognizes its unique trajectory and no longer seeks external validation. This can feel like standing slightly outside the usual flow of urgency that surrounds you. The world continues at its pace, but you are not pulled by it. You move within it, without being driven. This grants a quiet autonomy that does not need to be asserted. You may also sense a reduction in internal dialogue. Silence occupies more space. Thoughts still arise, but they are fewer and more precise. The observer does not comment on everything it notices. It selects what matters and allows the rest to pass. This stage is not dramatic. There are no markers, no milestones. It unfolds as a gradual normalization of ease. The system has integrated the rewrite to the point where it no longer feels like a process. It feels like baseline. You do not need to hold this state. You do not need to protect it. Effort would only reintroduce tension. The system sustains itself now. You remain within it naturally, without monitoring, without adjustment, without concern. The emotional distance that once signaled change is now indistinguishable from clarity. You are not watching from afar. You are present without distortion. The observer rests in recognition, and that recognition does not require a name. At this point, you may notice that even the idea of progress has softened. There is no sense of moving toward a better state. Improvement no longer motivates you. The system has stopped measuring itself against an imagined future. What remains is a quiet sufficiency. You are not incomplete. You are simply present. This changes how you relate to effort in subtle ways. Tasks still exist, responsibilities still appear, but they no longer carry existential weight. You do what is required without layering meaning on top of it. Action becomes functional rather than symbolic. The system distinguishes between what needs to be done and what does not need to be carried. You may sense that emotional responses now arise closer to the surface and resolve more quickly. There is less depth of entanglement. Feelings register, inform, and release. They do not spiral inward. This creates a sense of lightness that is not excitement, just reduced load. The system is no longer storing excess data. There can be moments when this lightness feels almost too neutral, as if something dramatic should be happening and isn't. The mind, accustomed to contrast, may search for peaks or lows, but the absence of drama is not a loss. It is stabilization. When the system is no longer oscillating, it appears quiet. You may also notice a change in how you experience connection. Interactions feel less charged. You can be close without merging, separate without withdrawing. There is room for others without sacrificing internal clarity. This balance does not require boundaries to be enforced. It emerges naturally from coherence. The sense of being watched, evaluated, or measured fades. You are less concerned with how you appear from the outside. The observer turns inward only enough to register alignment, not to judge. This reduces self-consciousness. You move through situations with less friction because you are not monitoring yourself. You might recognize that certain internal questions no longer arise. Questions about purpose, direction, or identity lose urgency, not because they have been answered, but because they are no longer necessary. The system no longer uses questions to orient itself. Orientation is internal and stable. There is also a shift in how you relate to information. You consume less without trying to. Excess input feels unnecessary. You are not seeking stimulation or insight. When information arrives, it integrates easily or passes without impression. The system filters naturally when coherence is high. You may become aware of a quiet confidence that does not assert itself. It does not announce decisions or defend positions. It is simply there, steady and unreactive. This confidence does not depend on certainty. It exists even when outcomes are unknown. As this continues, you may notice that even stillness becomes less noticeable. You are no longer aware of being calm. Calm is simply the absence of disturbance. The system no longer highlights it as a state. It becomes background. There can be brief moments where old patterns attempt to reassert themselves, usually under stress or fatigue. You may notice a familiar urge to rush, to fix, to control. But these urges dissolve quickly. The system recognizes them as outdated signals and does not amplify them. You may also sense a subtle gratitude that is not directed at anything specific, not appreciation for an event or outcome, but a quiet acknowledgement of stability. This gratitude does not seek expression. It does not need to be felt intensely. It exists as a baseline tone. In this phase, you are less inclined to narrate your experience to yourself. The internal commentary that once tracked every shift has quieted. You experience directly, without translation. This reduces distance between awareness and reality. The emotional distance that initiated this entire process is now almost forgotten. It has integrated into normal functioning. You do not feel removed. You feel present, without strain. The system no longer signals change because change has completed its function. There is nothing to sustain here, no practice to maintain. The rewrite has settled into structure. You live from it without reference to what came before. The observer remains, but it no longer stands apart. It is simply awareness, resting in coherence, without the need to watch itself watching. You may notice now that even recognition has softened, not disappeared, but become less pronounced. You are no longer tracking your internal state to confirm stability. The need to check has faded. The system does not require observation to remain coherent. It holds without supervision. This creates a different relationship with awareness itself. Attention rests where it lands without scanning. You are not trying to stay present. Presence occurs naturally. When the mind drifts, it returns without effort. There is no correction, no internal instruction. The system self-regulates quietly. You may also sense that anticipation has diminished. The future no longer feels like a destination you are approaching. It feels neutral, uncharged. You plan when planning is required, but planning does not occupy emotional space. The timeline extends without pulling you forward. You meet moments as they arrive. In this state, even emotional distance feels inaccurate as a description. There is no sense of separation from feeling. Instead, there is transparency. Emotions pass through without obstruction. You feel them clearly and release them cleanly. Nothing sticks. Nothing accumulates. You might notice that certain internal thresholds no longer exist. Lines you once felt you had to cross to feel ready, worthy, or complete have dissolved. Readiness is no longer a state you wait for. It is inherent. The system no longer delays itself through hesitation. This can show up as simplicity in action. You do not over-prepare. You do not over-explain. You respond directly to what is in front of you. Complexity falls away when it is not required. The system prefers efficiency when coherence is high. You may also experience moments where awareness feels wide without being diffuse. You are not focused on one thing, yet not scattered. There is a sense of holding the environment lightly, without attachment. This broad awareness does not demand interpretation. It simply registers. In this phase, the distinction between inner and outer experience becomes less rigid. You are less concerned with where a sensation originates. Whether it is internal or external matters less than whether it is relevant. The observer no longer categorizes excessively. It allows experience to be what it is. You might also sense a reduction in internal resistance to change. When circumstances shift, you adjust without delay. There is no period of friction where you argue with reality. Acceptance is immediate, not as resignation, but as recognition. The system aligns quickly because it is not defending a fixed position. There can be a subtle feeling of transparency in interaction. You are not hiding, but you are not revealing either. You are simply present. This reduces misunderstanding. Others may respond differently to you, though you may not notice it directly. The system emits less noise, and interactions reorganize themselves around that quiet. You may become aware that certain fears no longer activate, not because they have been resolved conceptually, but because their trigger conditions no longer exist. Fear required instability to operate. With stability present, it has no foothold. It fades without confrontation. In this state, effort feels optional. When effort is required, it is applied cleanly and released immediately after. There is no residual tension. The system does not carry effort forward. It resets naturally. You might also notice that rest feels deeper, not because you are exhausted, but because the system fully disengages when rest is available. Sleep, pauses, silence, integrate more completely. Recovery happens without interruption. There is a growing sense that nothing is being withheld from you. You are not waiting for permission, insight, or confirmation. The sense of delay dissolves. Time feels sufficient. The present feels complete. As this continues, the system becomes increasingly quiet. Not empty, but efficient. Signals arise only when necessary. Most of the time, there is nothing to report. This absence of signal is itself the signal. It indicates that coherence is holding. You do not need to mark this stage. You do not need to remember it. It does not serve as a reference point. The rewrite has moved beyond noticeability. It has become infrastructure rather than event. The observer does not step forward anymore. It does not need to. Awareness rests without commentary. You are not watching the system function. You are living within its balance, without interruption, without effort, without the need to recognize recognition itself. What becomes clear now is how little needs to be managed. You are no longer coordinating yourself from the inside. The subtle tension that once held everything together has released, and nothing has fallen apart. The system did not require constant oversight. It only required conditions stable enough to organize on its own. You may notice that even subtle preferences lose their emotional weight. You still choose, but choice feels neutral. There is no internal argument, no lingering doubt after a decision is made. Once movement begins, it completes itself cleanly. The system does not revisit paths already taken. It trusts its own calibration. There is a quiet humility in this state, not self-diminishment, but an absence of self-importance. You do not feel central to the unfolding of events, yet you do not feel irrelevant either. You occupy your position without exaggeration. The observer recognizes its place within the larger pattern and relaxes into it. You may also sense that attention is less drawn inward. Self-reference diminishes. You are less aware of yourself as a subject and more aware of what is occurring. This does not feel like disappearance. It feels like participation without self-monitoring. Experience flows without commentary. In moments where emotion does arise strongly, you notice how quickly it resolves. There is no accumulation. You feel fully, and then return to baseline without effort. This allows depth without instability. Intensity no longer threatens coherence. It is absorbed and released naturally. You might become aware that your internal rhythm has slowed slightly, not in action, but in perception. You notice more in less time. There is no rush to process. Awareness registers what is relevant and ignores the rest. The system filters without conscious control. There is also a noticeable reduction in internal narratives about meaning. You no longer ask what something says about you or where it leads. Events are allowed to exist without interpretation. This does not reduce significance. It removes distortion. Meaning appears when it is inherent, not when it is demanded. You may sense that even the concept of alignment has faded into the background. You are no longer checking whether you are aligned. Alignment is assumed unless proven otherwise. This trust reduces vigilance. The observer no longer stands guard, it rests. There can be moments where this quiet feels almost transparent, as if nothing is happening at all. But beneath that surface, the system is functioning with precision. Regulation, adjustment, response all occur without noise. The absence of sensation is not emptiness, it is efficiency. You might notice that external chaos no longer penetrates as deeply. You are aware of instability around you without being destabilized by it. The system distinguishes between observation and absorption. You witness without carrying. This preserves internal stillness, even in dynamic environments. In this phase, even the desire to understand has softened. Curiosity remains, but it is gentle. You explore without urgency. You allow not knowing without discomfort. The system does not require comprehension to remain stable. It functions through coherence, not certainty. There is a sense that nothing is being prepared. You are not in a holding pattern. Life is not waiting to begin. It is already occurring, quietly, without emphasis. You participate without needing to mark participation. The emotional distance that once drew your attention is now fully integrated. It no longer feels like distance at all. It feels like a clear boundary between signal and noise. You remain open without being flooded, present without being pulled. There is no final adjustment required, no last realization to arrive. The system has completed its rewrite, not with a declaration, but with silence. The observer no longer scans for confirmation. Confirmation is unnecessary when coherence is continuous. You remain here, not as a point in a process, but as a stable configuration. Nothing needs to follow from this. Nothing needs to change. The absence of demand is the clearest indication that the system is functioning as intended. You may notice now that nothing is asking for your attention, not because awareness has dulled, but because nothing is out of place. The system rests in its own balance. There is no alert, no pull, no internal signal requesting adjustment. This absence is not blankness, it is stability, holding without effort. You are not waiting for a feeling to arrive. You are not checking whether you are present enough, calm enough, clear enough. Those measurements no longer occur. The observer has stopped comparing states. It recognizes coherence by the lack of disturbance. Stillness is not something you enter. It is what remains when nothing needs correction. Experience continues to move through you, but it does not leave residue. Moments arrive and depart cleanly. There is no accumulation of meaning, no internal archive being built. What is relevant registers. What is not passes without friction. The system filters naturally, without instruction. You may sense that even the idea of holding this state feels unnecessary. There is nothing fragile here, nothing that could be lost through inattention. Effort would only reintroduce noise. The system sustains itself precisely because you are not involved in sustaining it. Time feels sufficient, not slow, not fast, simply adequate. There is no sense of lag, no sense of rushing ahead. You meet each moment at the point of contact, without anticipation and without delay. The timeline does not stretch or compress, it unfolds evenly. Emotion remains available, but it no longer defines the field. Feeling does not displace clarity. It appears, informs, and resolves. You are not required to stay with it or move away from it. It completes itself. This completion leaves no trace. You may become aware that silence has depth, not as an experience, but as a condition. Silence does not need to be noticed to be present. It holds beneath sound, beneath movement, beneath thought. You are within it, without needing to name it. There is no concluding insight arriving now, no final understanding settling in. The absence of culmination is deliberate. The system does not mark completion, it simply functions. When rewrites finish, they do not announce themselves. They disappear into normality. You do not need to remember how you arrived here. The path does not matter. The previous states do not matter. Comparison would only reintroduce distance. What remains is immediate and sufficient. You are not separate from what is happening. You are not merged with it either. You are present without emphasis. The observer no longer stands apart to verify this presence. Verification is unnecessary when stability is continuous. Nothing is being transmitted to you now. Nothing is being asked of you. The signal has quieted because it no longer needs amplification. Recognition does not repeat itself once it has settled. You remain as you are, without posture, without preparation, not paused, not progressing, simply here. The system holds, awareness rests, and nothing further is required.